All right, so welcome. We are going to start looking at the basics of the pandas library. So in the previous video, in the first video of this pandas playlist, I had downloaded a couple of data files from Kaggle, in particular this Netflix titles and this store sales forecasting CSV. And I'm just wanting to show you that I've got a demo folder on my desktop, and those two data files are right there in that demo directory. And we're going to be working out of this notebook. I'm just using an untitled notebook at the moment, so this untitled.ipynb. And as you can see, this is that opened notebook, that untitled file, and I've got my two data files right there in the same directory. All right, so we're going to start looking at pandas, and a big thing that pandas does for people in Python is it allows them to interface with external data. In particular, it's really useful for tabular data, which is something that most of us, if we've done any work with Excel, are very familiar with. So first thing, let's import pandas. And typically when we import pandas, we do it as this. So we say import pandas as PD. So we're going to use this alias PD so that whenever we're using methods from pandas, we don't necessarily have to type pandas every time. We can just type PD. All right, now one thing I do want to show, so let's look at the version, just make sure that everybody knows what version I'm on of both Python. So I'm going to look at my Python version is 3.12.3. And then if I want to look at pandas, I can do PD _ version. And I'm on pandas version 2.2.2. Now, if either of your versions are different, in particular the pandas version, that's not really, I don't believe, anything to worry about. So the functionality that I'm going to be looking at is really kind of core functionality that's been in pandas for a long time. And I would expect that, this functionality would continue to be supported even if you're on a later version, like maybe a 2.4, 2.3, or an earlier version, actually. So just to show you exactly what I'm running, so there might be some subtle changes, especially as we look at, some of the more, I would say, advanced concepts in pandas, but I would expect, the majority of these things are going to work regardless of the version. I just want to be very transparent about the version that I'm running. All right, so I'm going to delete those cells, just get everything nice and clean from the beginning. So did a restart. Imported pandas, and what we're going to do, again, as I mentioned, a big thing that pandas does is it allows us to interface with external data. So what we're going to start with is looking at input and output with pandas. All right, so if I start typing PD, hit dot, and then hit tab, we have access to all of the methods, all of the things that are available from the pandas library. So you can see there's a lot. And, given the amount of things that are included in pandas, we would definitely not be covering all of these in this playlist. We're going to look at the core things. But what we're going to start with are methods that start with read. So now if I say pd.read, and again, just hit tab, we can see that there's a bunch of methods that start with read. So read the clipboard, read a CSV file, read Excel. You can even read SQL, so reading from a database. SAS files, SPSS. So a lot of different interfaces for you to kind of load your external data in a variety of formats. All right, so what we're going to work with first is this store sales forecasting data. So it is a CSV file. So if I bring that out, you can see it stores sales forecasting CSV. So we got a comma separated values file. That's what CSV stands for. So we're going to use that read CSV method. And then since this it file is in the same directory as this notebook, I can just start typing STOR and hit tab, and it will give me things that are available that begin with STOR. And one of them is that store sales forecasting.csv, and it finds that path again because those data files are in the same directory as the notebook. All right, now I did choose this file for a particular reason, so it's not going to run without problems. So I did want to show you at least 99% out of the 99% of the times if people have formatted CSVs correctly, this is just going to run. But I did pick this one because this one does not just run. And I did that for a reason because I wanted to show you first what is, how do error messages look in pandas, and in particular the error message that it's going to give. I think this is one of the ones that can be somewhat confusing. And it is somewhat common, especially if you're dealing with data files that might have some special characters. Maybe it has, individuals' names that are from a non-Western country or a different country, and they have special characters in their name. So this is an error that I've encountered a few times. It can be a little bit ambiguous. So I wanted to show you how to solve that. All right, so I'm going to do a pd.readcsv, and it gives me an error immediately. Right? It's a Unicode decode error, and it says, hey, UTF-8 codec cannot decode byte 0xd2 in position 17654. All right, so what this is telling us is it's saying, okay, so you might not understand what a codec is, you might not understand what UTF-8 is, but ultimately what this is telling you is it's saying, hey, I've got essentially a particular language or a particular, think of it almost as a dictionary of characters that I understand. And there's a character in your data file that I don't know what to do with. And so I'm essentially throwing an error because I don't know how to handle this character. And that's basically what it's doing. So UTF-8 is just essentially the way of thinking about that is that's kind of a particular dictionary that includes information on certain characters. And apparently our data file has a character in there that it doesn't recognize. All right. Well, how can we get around that, right? Do we have to go in the file and fix the error? Not necessarily. So I'm going to get in this readcsv, hold down Shift and hit Tab, and you can see the doc string. So notice that there is a tremendous amount of methods that you can use with pandas data frames, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do to kind of customize the way that data is loaded. You can skip rows, set custom values for missing values. I'm trying to parse some dates. A lot of flexibility is built into this. And one of the things that is built in is the encoding, okay? So notice we've got encoding and encoding errors. Okay, so it's saying, hey, encoding, I expect this to be a string or none. By default, it's going to be set to none. And encoding errors can be a string or none, and it's set to strict. So let's look at the details on these two arguments in this readcsv. So I'm going to go all the way down, right? So this is telling us about each one of these arguments and how we can set parameters for those or values for those. All right, so here we go. So here's our encoding and encoding errors, right? So first off, the encoding argument is essentially specifying the encoding to use when reading or writing. All right, notice that it says, hey, the default here is going to be UTF-8. So by default, even though it said, string or none, and it's none, by default in the function argument, when that's true, it's using a UTF-8 encoding to use when reading or writing. All right, and a helpful thing that they actually do here is they actually pass us or point us to some other encodings that we could use. Right, so if I just open that link in a new tab, all right, so there's a lot of different encodings that are possible. And a lot of times with Python, as you can see, a lot of these functions here, even though we might not understand what codecs encode is, notice a lot of times things are defaulting to UTF-8. So that is usually the default encoding that's used. But I'm going to scroll way down to the bottom. This is a long piece of documentation. Right, here are some encodings that are available. All right, and you can see, let's go here to our UTF-8. If I scroll down here, we can see UTF-8 right here. That's kind of how it's defined. So it's supposed to work with all languages, but that encoding is essentially including that. Now, it turns out that a lot of times, again, if you see this error, and it could be like if you're working with Turkish, you might want to use something like this Mac Turkish or whatnot. So there's a lot of different encodings for different types of languages because, again, they have different characters in different languages that we might need to parse. So if you do have specific language, you can always look here and see if you can find one of these that's appropriate. 99% of the time, you don't have to do anything. But then in other cases, one that I have found that tends to work pretty well is this Latin 1. So this is a Western European codec or encoding. So I'm just going to use Latin 1. All right, so let's remember that. And before we put that in, let's actually look at these encoding errors. So remember, by default, that's set to strict. Let's look here and see what the possible types are. Let's see, so error handlers. We want to go, let's see, does it have anything? I'm just going to do a search real quick to error handlers. Let's see if that's on there. Let's just see if we can find the errors. All right, let me go up here to the top. So it's a little bit of a, so errors is equal to strict. So errors may be given to that. The default is strict, meaning that encoding errors, raise value errors refer to base classes here. So yeah, here's the values that you can use. So you can use a strict setting. So if it's strict, if it finds an error, something that it can't parse, it's going to raise an error. You can also use ignore. I would kind of, encourage you not to. This makes life easy, right? And we'll look at this. So you can say, well, ignore, but what it will do is it's just going to ignore the data and continue, right? So you're going to potentially lose data if you do that ignoring. And then you can also do maybe a replace. So let's look at a couple of these options real quick. So first off, all right, let me do this kernel restart clear. So we have a problem, right? This doesn't run. So I'm going to move this down to another line. Let's first say, well, gosh, we don't want to figure out what the encoding is. So I'm hitting Shift Tab, and let's just say, well, you know what? We want to take our encoding errors, and by default, that's equal to strict. Let's just set that equal to ignore. All right. So now this runs, right? You can see that we've got data in what looks to be a tabular format. And if we notice here towards the bottom, it says you've got 2,121 rows. All right, well, is that all of the data? Well, probably not, right? Because we know there was errors in there, but we said to ignore. Well, how many rows did we lose, right? We don't really have that information, but it will run. Let's do replace, all right? All right, so this runs, right? So in this case, we still have the number of rows, but apparently somewhere in here, there was a character that got replaced, right? So again, in this case, we ended up getting the same amount of rows, but there is somewhere in this data frame, it's going to be somewhat hard to see, again, because we can't display all 2,121 rows right here, but some characters will be replaced, okay? So another thing to note is when we did that ignore, apparently it didn't just ignore the whole row, which is nice. So maybe it just, put a missing value in one of those cells because it said, hey, I don't understand what's going on here. But again, you could be losing data. The best way to handle this is to find an encoding that is appropriate for your data. So in this case, I'm going to say, what was it? Latin 1 is what we'll use. And Latin 1 should work. There we go. All right, so we've read in our data, right? There's a little bit of pain there, right? I just wanted to, again, kind of show you, that common error, because that one tends to be one that can be a little bit tricky to troubleshoot, because again, the error message that comes back, while absolutely correct, can again be a little bit arcane to understand. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to save this in an object called data. All right, so I'm going to restart my kernel, run that, and then that's where I'm going to stop this video. And in the next video, we will start working with this data object and looking at some of the core data types that are available to us in pandas and how we work with those data types.